Okay, so I'm going to start with the apple and what's around the apple. So I'm working in my greens, which, as you know, are not truly green, but they're going to be the best we can get using this palette. So green, as you have found out, green is a weakness of this palette. But once we get it's a very harmonious palette that, because it's mixed from the same family of colors, it's what increases the appearance of intensity in the colors, even though that green is not a very intense green. So looking again at the painting, at the still life. So I've got the dark in the background here. My darkest darks on the apple are on the left and right edges, and then inside the dimple where the stem is. And then it moves into a darker but not mid-tone, not middle gray shadow that really is the left third and right third of the apple. And then it moves into mid-tones and then my lighter tones just at the top. So I'm going to start with my darker values. So I'm going to get a little bit of Gamsol, a little bit, tiny touch of medium, working fat over lean. And I'm going to go down here and I'm going to get my darker green. And I'm going to lay in those darkest values. So as I use my grisaille painting as a guide to help me identify where those darker values should go and to lay them in there correctly so that when I complete the painting, all of those values should be correctly assigned with the color. There's a little touch of a really dark green right here at the bottom. There's that dark shadow of the stem and a dark green right inside the dimple. Now, as I move into my next value over from that darkest dark, so when I lay that paint in, I'm able to tell whether or not my values are correct, because if they are, it'll be exactly the same value as the gray underneath it. So I'm not trying to blend here. Blending will happen optically as you step away from the painting at this point. I'm not looking for really subtle blending. What happens if you do that really subtle blending too early is the painting kind of gets weak and disappears when you step away from it. So looking for everywhere this slightly lighter but still in shadow value is. Got a big sort of chunk of it over here. So when I get to areas where the value changes, I can soften that edge a little bit, but I'm not trying to over blend it. I think that dimple area up top should go a little lighter in both sides. Okay. So as I'm looking at my grisaille painting, I think this area is too light in my underpainting. I think I went too far on my scumbling there. So I think I'm going to move into that middle value of green. But one thing that happens as I get into that middle value on the front of the apple is the color appears to be a little more intense. So I'm going to step over towards my yellow a little bit and less black and intensify that color while I'm still working within that shadow value. I'll drop it down a little bit here. So where those values blend together, I will drag a little bit of one value into the other, but again, not trying to overstate the blending. Then that middle color and value starts to shift and go a little lighter as it comes up towards the top where that light rolls over the top of the apple as it goes into that dimple where the stem is. A little more shadow on that whole side here. And then there's not a really strong light behind the stem, just on the very top edge. So then the lightest part of the apple is right across that front edge. So I'm gonna, and it's also more intense. So I'm gonna move into my lighter value, a little bit more intensely pigmented with the yellow. Oop, need to go even lighter than that. Now this is not the lightest value that I see on the painting, because if I squint my eyes, some of this white out here is lighter than the lightest value on the apple, and this is lighter down here as well. So I don't want to get distracted by making the light on my apple too light. So right in here, there we go. So I've got that hard edge of that opening where the dimple, where the stem is. And then a little bit of that light wraps around on the top back edge of the apple. And a little bit of that light comes down the front here and a little bit just here. So if you come up and look at this, it's not over blended, but if you stand back from it, it holds together, right? Does that make sense? The next step of the painting, you can blend to your heart's content, but you don't want to overblend now. It will really make your painting weak if you overblend too soon. So looking at the background values, so this light here, it's a halftone, but it's not a whole lot lighter than our middle gray in my whites. So I'm going to come over here to my gray. And I can check that value and color by holding it up. Yeah. So even though that napkin is white, like I know the color of it is white, most of it is actually a halftone gray. But it reads as much lighter than the apple. So what you're doing is you're painting relationships of colors and values. And the benefit of using this grisaille palette is your values are already figured out by the time you start applying the color. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a lighter value down here, down on the corner. Still painting pretty lean, not a whole lot of paint yet. Got a lighter value. Those light and shadow shapes on the edge of the napkin. Okay, now, when it comes over here to the darker side of the apple over here and the darker side of the apple here, the value of the napkin doesn't change all that much. What changes is the contrast between the napkin and the apple. So if I squint my eyes, the value shift from the top of the apple to the napkin is very subtle. It's almost a lost edge right in here. Where I see the more dramatic contrast is where the shadow on the apple is darker. So the napkin is going to appear to be lighter in contrast. So I may need to, in a very subtle way, shift my values across the top of the apple so that optically it's going to give that sense of space that I want it to have. So if I'm slightly darker, here, I'm going to come back and repaint the stem. So with the stem, I would not sacrifice good painting to leave the stem there. I would go back and work the painting and then repaint the stem because it's a detail. So if I go a little darker in value here, I'm going to darken it just a smidge more so that I really do get that lost edge feeling between the back of the apple and still a little bit light. There we go, that's better. So I get a little bit of that lost edge there. Then I'm going to adjust my value. A little more, loosen that paint up a little bit. So I'll adjust my value to be slightly lighter over here so that you get more of that sense of contrast. And then I've got a shadow, halftone shadow on a roll of fabric. So these are all my halftones in here, and then when I get to wanting to look at some of those subtle changes, like where there's a little crease right here. So just looking at how that plane shifts on that little crease of fabric, where the lighter value is on the top of that fold. I've got a light right up here where that crease is, and it drags down. And across. Then where these light and dark areas that are going to transition into wrinkles in the fabric, I'm looking at the shape and the value, and then I'll come back and work on really blending that at a later point. I'm just looking for the broad statement of value and color at this point. And I want to, even though I'm starting to talk about some of the shifts in that napkin, I do want to be aware that it is a vertical plane against the wall. And I don't want it to look like it's a super, like, crazy crumpled piece of material. So then as I go here on the background, that's sort of, I'm gonna go really kind of into my violet black. Because shadows tend to be cooler and more violet. So where the value doesn't change here, but the color changes and the temperature changes a little bit. So that I can see, oops, made that too light with my black. So that I can perceive a subtle difference between the dark part of the apple and the dark behind it. And some of that is what we've talked about with the warm and the cool, and using contrasting and complementary colors. So the red and the green, if I add red to that black, it's going to work in a complementary way to the green of the apple. So I start to visualize, and I might not even be able to articulate it if I'm looking at it, but I can start to see a difference between this dark and this dark because their chroma is opposite. Please don't be texting. So then when I get down in here, I'm going to talk about our neutrals. So the cardboard that the apple and orange are sitting on, it's a neutral, so I'm going to go with a little bit of yellow, a little bit of black, a little bit of my red, remembering that the red is the strongest, most highly saturated color on my palette. I'm going to be very careful with it, and I'm going to add a little bit of white to it because my ground tone is a middle gray. So I've got the value right, but the color is not quite right. I need a little more yellow. So I'm going to add a little more yellow ochre, but I want to make sure it doesn't turn green. It's a little dark, but the color, I think, is working pretty well. So behind, where that light comes from behind the apple, it's going to set up that contrast so that the apple pulls out in front of that neutrally kind of value. Then where my darkest dark is, where that cast shadow is, that cast shadow is going to get fuzzier and lighter. It's very dark right underneath the apple, and then it gets fuzzier and lighter as it moves away from the apple. And then I'm going to come around, oops, camera's shaking, in front of that cast shadow. So right underneath the apple, the transition from the cast shadow to the light area is quite sharp, quite sudden. And then again, you get that slight fuzzing of that shadow as it comes out away from the object that is casting the shadow. Ooh, I keep hitting my camera, sorry about that. Then I'll bring that neutral down. Okay. And then the contrast between that neutral and the white of that cloth is quite intense. So I'm going to just lay that white in there. It might be too bright, too high key. But I do want to make sure I get that contrast. I can bring that back down in value if I need to as I continue the painting.